to Clarity in a Messy World, the podcast that looks at the causes behind the most confounding issues of our time. I'm David Wayne Callahan. In every episode, I'll be speaking with experts who will share their knowledge and insights and help us to untangle a seemingly chaotic world. Clarity in a Messy World is a production of Bocconi University in collaboration with the Bocconi Student Media Center. Looking back to the last decade in politics, one of the most striking phenomena has been the rise of populists worldwide, a seemingly unstoppable wave that has impacted both local and global affairs. But with a pandemic raging on, populist themes seemed to recede into the background of public discourse. Will COVID mark the end of this populist era? Joining us today is Professor Catherine de Vries. Catherine de Vries is Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and Professor of Political Science at Bocconi University. In her work, she examines some of the most pressing issues facing the European continent today, such as Euroscepticism, migration, and the rise of populism. She is author of the award-winning book Euroscepticism and the Future of European Integration, and she just published her second book, Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenger Parties in Europe, co-authored with Sara Hobolt with Princeton University Press. Catherine, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here, David.
Catherine, regardless what one thinks personally about populist leaders, many were chosen democratically. What is the global rise in populism telling us about democracy today?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a key question at the moment. So I think before I answer it, it's important to define populism. So the way political scientists often think about populism is a thin ideology. So it really has a core component in the sense that it sees society as being separated in two homogeneous conflictual groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite. And politics should become an expression of the general will of these pure people. But because it's a thin-centered ideology, it also can be really, malleable and linked to other ideologies like socialism or perhaps more conservative stances. So populism in and of itself is not necessarily anti-democratic. It basically is more anti-elite than it is anti-democratic. But when it gets combined with other positions like nativism or xenophobic nationalism, especially among populist right parties, we do think that maybe some of the liberal norms, especially when it comes to rule of law and minority rights, are being put under pressure by the rise of populism.
And to what extent are established parties affected by the rise in populism, and how are they reacting to this?
So I think from an established party point of view, we call them also sometimes dominant parties. So those are parties that have dominated party systems. In many countries, these are the parties of the center left and the center right. And they really became popular and big by raising issues that are related to the left-right. So let's say state intervention in the economy, the extent to which there should be a generous welfare state or a less generous one. And then populism is often difficult for these parties because populists tend to raise issues, for example, Euroscepticism or overall, disdain of international politics and international cooperation, or things like anti-immigration positions. And those are issues that are not necessarily shared by the constituencies of these more established centrist parties. So they find it difficult to really deal with this, and often it drives a wedge in their constituency. So then these dominant established parties have basically two strategies. They either can ignore populist parties, and they've done, for example, in many Western European countries, they've done so by having grand coalitions, grand spanning coalitions that include parties on the left and the right, but exclude the populist parties. Or they could accommodate populist parties by actually talking about some of the issues that they raise. But then, of course, they very much risk being kind of split themselves. So if you then want to think about, which was more successful, this ignoring or accommodating, overall, what we kind of outline in the kind of work that I've done with Sara Hobolt in the book Political Entrepreneurs is that probably the accommodating is more risky for an established party. Because for the reason that I outlined, so the fact that they're internally divided on this issue, but also because many established parties have these existing relationships with other established parties. So if you accommodate a populist party, you might actually alienate some of your friends, if you will. So, for established parties in many systems, it's been quite tricky to deal with the rise of populism.
So, Catherine, you've described for us what a populist party is, but in your research paper for the LSE Public Policy Review, you talk of challenger parties and populist parties. Could you tell me what are the differences and the similarities between the two?
So, as I defined earlier, populist parties are really characterized by a thin ideology of pitting what they call a corrupt elite against the pure people. And they see that, the populist parties, should be those ones that are representing the pure people in politics. So in the way that we define challenger parties are basically those parties that haven't had government experience. So if we come back to populist parties, some of them have been in government and some have not. So not all challenger parties are also populist parties, because some populist parties, like for example, let's think about Lega in Italy, has had government experience before. However, there's also a clear similarity between populist parties and challenger parties, and that is because what I mentioned before, this pitting a corrupt elite against the pure people, this kind of rhetoric is also something that challenger parties do. So challenger parties are those parties that haven't been in government, but are trying to disrupt basically the dominance of dominant parties in the system, of these center-left and center-right parties that we talked about earlier. And they try to disrupt that by doing two things. First, introducing an issue that kind of drives a wedge in the constituency of dominant parties. So that's what we call a policy innovation. But they also do, together with that, a rhetorical innovation by basically telling voters that those center-right parties, those or center-left parties, are basically not the real representatives of the issues that voters care about. So they're also really trying to attack the competence and the credibility of dominant parties, established parties in the system. So I think what challenger parties and populist parties have in common is this use of anti-establishment rhetoric in order to basically discredit established parties and convince voters that those are not the kind of parties that they should be voting for. But on the other hand, what they should do is support, a populist or challenger party in an election.
It's interesting. It sounds like they're stepping into a sticky situation. It sounds like, using this rhetoric, talking about the corrupt elite, versus the pure population. You could see that could fire people up, especially if they're feeling angry or frustrated. But it sounds like an easy way to get in, but not an easy way to stay, because of course it's easier to identify and see problems than to actually figure out how to solve problems. No?
No, that's definitely the case. I mean, I think a good case in point, kind of an illustration of what you're asking me, is the current five-star movement in Italy, which started out really as kind of an anti-establishment party, very deliberately using different ways of communicating with their base by using social media, also really saying we're different than everyone else. Then it enters government at that moment in time with another populist party, the Lega, but when that doesn't go so well, they actually have to stay in government by then coalescing with a traditional dominant party in Italian politics, the Democratic Party. And now being in government forces the five-star movement to make concessions, to find common ground, and that doesn't fit very nicely with their ultimate kind of anti-establishment rhetoric that they use to kind of gain electoral prominence.
Catherine, is there a left or even a liberal populism, or is populism conceived exclusively as a right-wing phenomenon?
So as I mentioned before, populism is kind of seen as a thin-centered ideology. So it has this core element of, the corrupt elite versus the pure people, but it can definitely be linked to other ideologies that are stronger ideologies, more consistent belief systems. So think about socialism, think about conservatism, for example. So you have definitely populist parties on the left, and you have populist parties on the right, and even maybe of the center. Of the political spectrum. I can give you a couple of examples. So, for example, one of the most oldest populist party is the National Front, or now called National Rally in France, under the leadership of Marine Le Pen, which is a far right party, a quite extreme right party. But there's also populist parties on the left. Think of Podemos. Which is a grouping that was established in 2014 or 2013 in Spain, that is really associated as a more far left party. Then there is a party that's more difficult to distinguish. That was probably the Five Star Movement, had some left and right elements. But you even can think of a populist party as a single issue party. Think, for example, as the Brexit party in Britain, that in the 2019 European parliamentary election really only campaigned on the issue of hard Brexit.
Mm-hmm. And, well, obviously, as an American, what comes to mind is Donald Trump's rise in 2016 as a political outsider, when he rose to victory by promising to build a wall to keep out the Mexicans, which became a chant.
No, definitely. I mean, President Donald Trump, at that moment in time, candidate for the presidency, Donald Trump, really kind of disrupted the Republican Party in the way that I talked about, by both a policy innovation, so basically being much more anti-immigrant and explicitly anti-immigrant and exclusionary compared to Republicans in the past, but also really using a very different style, a very different rhetoric to talk about politics. So doing it via Twitter, for example, and also basically calling the mainstream media or basically challenging the position of the mainstream media, and also talking about Washington as kind of a corrupt swamp that needs to be cleaned, right? So he was clearly using a lot of anti-establishment rhetoric, and also providing actually this kind of policy innovation. And in that way, is not very different from some kind of far-right populist that you see in Europe, on the European continent. However, what's interesting about the American example is because it's so difficult for parties, for new parties, to develop in the system. It's a really, winner takes all, majority takes all system, that disruption, that kind of populism comes then often from within the party. And that also, has a big bearing on government, because, he actually entered government, became the president, and could wield a lot of power. Oftentimes, in many systems, you see that populists stay a little bit at the sidelines for exactly the reasons that we talked about, that actually going into government forces you into concessions, which is not so easy. But if you can wield the power as a president yourself, it actually might be, probable of implementing some of that policy that you've used, or that you've kind of mobilized and campaigned on in the election.
Yes. Well, we've certainly seen the full extent of the power of the executive branch, as might have been even exaggerated with Donald Trump. It's really, making us question a lot of the things we have set up, a lot of not only what is law, but what is simply convention in America, how people have conventionally, supported what we have before us.
Yeah, so I think what's really clear when you think about kind of in political science about democratic erosion, so the extent to which democratic norms come under attack, then we often think about that, do people support democracy? But actually, in a lot of work that we've seen recently, what seems to be crucial is the extent to which elites actually uphold those democratic norms.
Catherine, you mentioned before several of the populist parties currently in power or seeking power in Europe. Regarding Europe, are there common denominators between the populist parties that have been on the rise?
So I think one of the key elements that populists have in common is their rhetoric. So the extent to which they attack the established system, or they attack political elites within that system. So this anti-establishment rhetoric, which we in our political entrepreneurs book, think as the core element of being a disruptor in politics. That's definitely what populist parties in Europe have in common. However, as I talked about, there is also other elements of ideology that often populist parties pack on. So you do see distinctive versions of left populism and right populism. Left populism often associated with a critique of rising inequality, also sometimes combined with a critique about Europe and austerity politics coming out of Europe. And on the right, what you often see is a coherent anti-immigration stance and also an anti-EU stance, but more, focusing on sovereignty concerns or national control concerns.
Catherine, you state in a recent Washington Post article that the COVID pandemic inspired a rally around the flag response for many incumbents, but that this response has not lasted, specifically in Brazil with President Jair Bolsonaro and in Britain with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and of course in America, where in the recent election, the populist incumbent, President Donald Trump, lost a second term to a traditional party candidate, Joe Biden. And certainly the pandemic played a major role in his defeat. Given that the populists I've mentioned have not managed the pandemic well, could the COVID crisis spell the end of populism?
So I think in this particular question, it's really important to separate the immediate health crisis. So when we're thinking about kind of the pandemic starting and now also the vaccine rollout, that immediate health crisis from the economic recovery that is going to come and the maybe long-term economic cost and economic crisis that we're going to see. So if we think about that immediate health crisis, that what we see is that people actually have turned back to competence, right? So I talked about it before. Populists are disruptors, right? They're not necessarily the ones that are, derive a lot of pleasure from necessarily being government and implementing their ideas. They like kind of disruption in terms of policy innovation and rhetorical innovation. So, and what you saw in that immediate health crisis is that actually people turned back to the more managerial players in politics, which are the established parties. They wanted the virus to be under control. They wanted to, now they want to get vaccinated, and that's really clear. So this has really then led a lot of pundits to write, well, this is the end of populism, the pandemic. But I would really urge us to be very careful with that type of conclusion now, because, a lot of the way in which governments have dealt with the health crisis was to shut down the economy. And we've not necessarily seen all the fallout and the economic kind of hurt of that yet. Also, we know that pandemics really have unequal economic consequences. We know that from kind of historical research. So especially when the economic recovery would take long and is very unequal, that will generate a lot of grievances, and that provides an opportunity for populists to come back and also mobilize those grievances like they've done in the past. Think, for example, after the financial crisis in 2008.
And you also see that his electoral defeat has not communicated or inspired a change in mode because it's proven effective. And do you see this kind of approach of throwing red meat to the base as the new rule in American politics? Does it have traction in other countries?
So I think that, the way in which when we think about kind of an innovation or think about a disruption, it often is just not disruptive when you try to do what other parties have done already, right? So you really can't win against an established party based on your managerial skills. They're pretty good at that. And that's what, made them quite popular. So what a lot of kind of populist parties and disruptors do in politics is indeed, looking at the more kind of extreme positions and trying to galvanize those, and especially those issues that are pretty difficult to deal with when it comes to competitors. Definitely, Donald Trump's record as an incumbent was difficult, and it was difficult to defend in this election, but still he got a considerable amount of the vote, and he was actually able on some of the kind of, constituencies that or characteristics of people that have voted for Trump in the past. Think about, more lower educated voters in rural places. He's actually been able to let them turn out more. So it's not necessarily an idea that this is the defeat of that type of kind of mobilization and rallying to the base. Quite the contrary. Actually, what you see in more European political systems, where it's not two-party competition, but many parties, you indeed see that populists often, take quite extreme positions in the system, because that, generates media attention, that allows them to differentiate themselves from competitors, and also, really allows them to galvanize with some of the dissatisfaction. So what they're trying to do is, find scapegoats. May they be immigrants? May they be the international trade system? May they be China? May they be the EU? And that's the kind of rhetoric that they use in order to galvanize that dissatisfaction with the existing elite.
Joining us now is Sara Hobolt, professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, with whom you co-authored the provocative new book, Political Entrepreneurs. Welcome, Sara.
Thanks for having me.
In this book, you examine together political change in post-war Europe and draw important parallels from history to help explain current phenomena. Sara, to what extent do historical examples of challenger parties breaking through and coming to power help us to understand the current rise of challenger parties in Europe?
Well, often when we think of challengers, we think of these recent electoral successes, in particular on the radical right and of populist parties. But challenger parties that seek to disrupt the political market and that act as political entrepreneurs, mobilizing new issues, they have been around for a long time. And in our book, Political Entrepreneurs, the oldest example that we look at is socialist parties. And today, of course, we think of socialist or social democratic parties as quintessentially mainstream. But if we look at the historical development of these parties, they were challengers when they first emerged in the late 19th century across Western Europe. They campaigned on a radical platform of universal suffrage for the working classes, and they promised a sort of brighter socialist future. And it was really only later, when they had achieved widespread electoral successes, that they became these catch-all parties of parliamentary and executive dominance that we know today. And the social democratic parties at the time, when they emerged, employed many of the same strategies that we can see from challenger parties today. So first of all, they were issue entrepreneurs. So they used policy innovation. They had these radical objectives involving sort of a complete restructuring of the economy through a social revolution and the abolition of classes. But they also had more intermediary goals focusing on the rights and conditions of the working class. And this was a new issue that it was very hard for the traditional conservative and liberal parties to deal with. And secondly, they were also innately anti-establishment in their rhetoric. So as long as workers didn't have full political rights, which was a key campaigning issue for them, the social democratic movement was inherently at odds with the political establishment. And they used this really as a core of their appeal to rally against the establishment. So I think that, and that's also something we show in the book, that we can learn from the strategies employed by previous waves of challengers, the socialist and also the green parties, to find commonalities with the strategies that challenger parties use today.
Sara, how do recent developments in British and American politics differ from what we're currently experiencing in continental Europe?
A crucial difference that we've already discussed is really that of the electoral systems that we have in the US and the UK on the one hand, and those that are predominant on the continent in Europe. So both in the US and the UK, we have these majoritarian winner-takes-it-all systems, which makes it very hard for challengers to enter the party system and be successful. And in contrast, on the continent, we have much more permissive proportional systems, and they have much lower barriers to entry for challenger parties. And what that tends to lead to is much greater fragmentation of the party system on the continent in Europe, and challengers find it easier to emerge from outside the established parties. They are therefore also much more likely, they do get representation, but they tend to not dominate in the sense that they become sort of majority parties. In contrast, in the UK and the US, where we have the majoritarian electoral system, it's much harder for new parties, new entrants, or even smaller parties to gain an electoral foothold. And that's even a sort of recent example in the UK is when a new salient issue emerged around Brexit, which really split the existing parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, right down the middle. And even then, it was incredibly hard for new parties to emerge successfully at the sort of national parliamentary level in the UK. So there was attempts. There was obviously first UKIP, which had influence but not electoral success in general elections. There was the Brexit Party subsequently, again, influence but not representation in the UK. And then there were also centrist parties that stood for Remain. We've probably forgotten all about them now, but they tried, the Independent Group or Change UK. And they didn't manage. So these challengers find it difficult to gain electoral foothold. And we are therefore more likely to see the emergence of challengers within the dominant parties. We talked about Donald Trump in the US, this anti-establishment figure taking over the established Republican Party from within. And to some extent, there's a parallel in the UK with the Brexiteer Boris Johnson, who, challenged his very own party during the referendum campaign in 2016, took the opposite position of Prime Minister Cameron at the time, but then now emerged as the leader of that very party and the Prime Minister of the UK. So these challenges to the established way of doing politics is more likely to happen from within established parties in first past the post majoritarian systems in the UK and the US, rather than through the successes of challenger parties that work outside the established parties on the continent in Europe.
And what are the prospects for populist parties in Europe? And more broadly, will they survive the COVID pandemic, or will they even prosper from the economic and social disruption that it leaves in its wake?
It's a great question. Of course, we don't, exactly, none of us have a crystal ball, but we did see in the first wave of the coronavirus, incumbents across the world experienced a real boost in their popularity. There was this rally around the flag effect that you've discussed already with Catherine, where many voters turned to the unifying safety and competence of the established parties over this more polarizing identity politics of challengers. And coupled with the victory of Biden over Trump in America, this has led some commentators to argue that the age of populism is over. But I think, and Catherine and I have argued, that we need to be cautious about declaring this end of populism, or indeed the end of populist parties. We've already seen the public turn against governing parties in countries where the crisis have been seen as handled less well. One example is, of course, Trump, but also in the UK, Boris Johnson and his government is far less popular now than it was back in March and April. And moreover, there are more structural, fundamental reasons why challenger parties and populist parties can reemerge. In the book Political Entrepreneurs, what we show is that there's been a loosening of ties between parties and voters in Europe over the last decades. So voters are less attached to parties and they're more likely to switch between parties in elections. So that means even if they now support the incumbent, that doesn't mean they won't turn against the incumbent and the mainstream parties again when things turn for the worse. And evidence has also shown that electoral support for right-wing populist and far-right parties tend to grow during economic and financial crisis. And that especially right-wing populist entrepreneurs are very good at finding scapegoats for economic and societal problems. So unfortunately, as it seems, there is an economic downturn already here, but also likely to grow in terms of rising unemployment across Europe. In the wake of the public health crisis that is the corona pandemic, this is something that could be exploited by populists. So I think it's too early to say that it's all over for populist challenges.
Well, Catherine and Sara, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
I'm David Wayne Callahan, and this has been Clarity in a Messy World, a podcast from Bocconi University. Thanks for listening. You can find references from this episode in the podcast notes. To be notified when new episodes come up, subscribe to Clarity on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or Spreaker.